and saw my partners on the ground from Argentina to Sri Lanka. And I had a very early lens on what is now the major force of my life, which is one, as we all know, talent is everywhere. But secondly, if talent is everywhere and everyone has access to technology, you're going to have global innovation and global entrepreneurship at a scale that we've never seen before. And so my journey since I sold my company a few years ago has been really investing in and mentoring amazing entrepreneurs, particularly in rising and emerging markets, but still some here in America. And honestly, in these very complicated and tough days, it's really one of the most hopeful ways one could spend their time, because there's a lot of very exciting things happening bottom up in places in the world many of us don't think a lot about.
Yeah, thank you. So speaking of your various endeavors in different parts of the world, so can you first talk about what, we know you sold your company and like you've been investing and like being just researching different areas. So can you share like what are you currently working on right now and what you are most excited about?
So I have several different pockets by which I invest, and then I mentor hundreds of entrepreneurs around the world that I don't necessarily invest in, but I'm happy, to be helpful over a long journey of getting to know people. Overall, Next Billion Ventures is one of the focal points. And we look at entrepreneurs in 3 global hubs. And so we think about it as kind of Singapore and Southeast Asia, Dubai for the Middle East, and a little bit of Sao Paulo, Mexico City for Latin America. And having said that, because the world has become so global, I've done some investments in East Africa and Europe and other parts of the world as well. But those are really kind of anchoring hubs because one, the rule of law is quite good for the most part. And then secondly, a lot of the capital is there. But that their hubs mean that the spokes are enormous. So I spend a lot of time thinking about places like Indonesia and all across Latin America, not just one particular given city. We only invest side by side with great venture capitalists on the ground who really understand the ground because we believe that we bring some expertise from all the different things that we see. But as we'll talk a little bit now, innovation and technology and entrepreneurship is a local thing. And if you don't understand your own market and navigate your own market, you won't do anything there as successful as you can. So I get up in the morning from about 5 o'clock and I start in Asia or China and I sweep around through the Middle East and Europe and Latin America on Zoom. And previous to that, I would fly 250,000 miles a year to really spend time on the ground with these amazing women and men who are really trying not only to build great enterprises, but they really are looking to better their societies.
Well, that sounds amazing. So I know you have a book about entrepreneurship in Middle East. So I'm kind of curious, like, what was your first contact moment with the Middle East? We know that you have a degree, you sort of like have some academic background when you were at Harvard, but what made you really just to sort of really look into the Middle East? Is there a particular event? And, what's your big findings there?
So, like I said before, I was curious about, to me, one of the most central questions of our time today. And people ask me a lot, like, what's the most important technology? And we can talk about AI or genomics or many amazing things that are happening today. But for me, the thing that's least understood is not the technology itself, but it is this global access to technology. And as I mentioned before, I began to get exposed to that from an operator's lens, looking at what entrepreneurs were doing around the world. But to your question about the Middle East, you have to understand, in America, you were pretty much raised with one narrative of the Middle East. That's kind of what you were raised in understanding. And often a lot of Americans ask me, why do you care about the Middle East? To which my instant reaction is always, why don't you? This has been one of the most central dynamics globally for us and for the world overall. Isn't it good for us to understand it? But again, our understanding was a lens usually of conflict or whatever the news would put down on us. And through an organization called the Young Presidents Organization, I began to spend a lot of time with remarkable CEOs from the Arab world who talked quite early about the rising ecosystem of tech startups. And candidly, at first, I thought it was a sideshow. I didn't think it could be that interesting. We in America knew that Israel was getting very interesting, but we didn't know elsewhere. And lo and behold, in 2010, in the fall, they hosted what was the first major gathering of startups of the Arab world. And they had me come almost kicking and screaming to keynote a speech and mentor some young people. And I realized, however, when I did show up and about 2 hours into it, that my life had changed forever. Because it was 3,500 young people from all over the Arab world who did not care about politics and did not want to talk about President Obama's Cairo speech. They wanted to build and solve problems. There's additional 3,500 people, trying to get in who couldn't get in. I actually extended that trip and I went to Amman, Jordan. I went to Cairo, Egypt, and met hundreds of the same. And I realized that if it was happening here and we didn't know about it, it was probably happening everywhere at scale. And remember, at this point, China was still relatively in its infancy. China, of course, has become the great case study of what is happening in global innovation. But this was happening everywhere. And I write all my life, honestly, Yunxin, a little selfishly. It's a way for me to clear my head and to put things down so I can't really BS myself and I can really understand what's going on. But having sold my company, I realized I wanted to do a deep dive into this question. So I spent over a year, almost 18 months, effectively commuting all across the Arab world and gathering data and information. And I wrote this book called Startup Rising, whose last publication came out about 3 years ago. Like any tech book, the minute it comes out, it's already dead because technology moves so quickly. But the premises of what I saw and put in that book are as true in Southeast Asia and Latin America and Europe and everywhere else. It's a global phenomenon, but the lens began with this amazing and very hopeful view of a new generation in the Middle East.
Yeah, that sounds promising. And also, yeah, I just think it's very incredible for you to actually truly be a advocate for globalization. So based on all your findings and research, what do you think Silicon Valley investors and entrepreneurs can learn from those in emerging markets? And
this is
right. Yeah.
It's a very important question. And in fact, vice versa really is the answer, because I believe we've entered an era of co-authorship. And this is something that particularly American innovation communities and certainly the American political community is very slow to appreciate. Because historically, when you think about it, literally every decade since World War II, to make it in global technology fundamentally meant to either make it in or sell it to the West, or to make it in and actually sell it to America. And this was even true of hardware companies. If you looked at what came out of Japan in the era of Sony and that kind of stuff, and even Samsung a bit later, much of what allowed them to scale so large was an engagement in American markets. Even 8 or 10 years ago, if we had this conversation about everybody having access to technology, that was viewed as an opportunity effectively for an American company to show up and to win. And so for years, the Facebook, the Twitter, the WhatsApp of almost anywhere in the world where they weren't banned was Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, what have you. Then all of a sudden, in the last few years, things began to shift dramatically. They began to shift, of course, in China, which America was very slow to appreciate. I remember giving a speech to about 200 young foreign service officers the week that Alibaba went public. And I asked for a show of hands of how many people in the room knew who Jack Ma was. And like 7 hands went up out of 200 people. It just was kind of slow to appreciate what it meant. It was sort of written off as a copycat thing, everything else. But what we didn't understand, and what was so important, was not only was Alibaba an amazing company that had a very successful IPO, but almost all of its revenue came not from the West. It was a moment of a shift. And we see this now more recently, right? You would think that if Uber showed up in a market with all the data and all the capital and amazing understanding of the business and incredible tech infrastructure and tech talent, they should win in a market. Well, that didn't happen in Southeast Asia, right? We know that Grab, at the end of the day, they ended up putting an investment in. In a way, it didn't happen in the Middle East because they had to acquire their largest competitor. And they had to acquire their largest competitor in the Middle East because, one, it was amazing and an amazing management team, and it understood local dynamics in a very powerful way, and they couldn't beat them. And secondly, they knew if they didn't buy it, maybe Didi would. These dynamics, Yunxin, are completely different from 7 or 8 years ago. So this is a real era of opportunity to really think about, one, what is happening in other markets on its terms. This is a lesson not just for America, but it's for any company or any investor or any policymaker who's thinking globally. And secondly, what can each side bring to the table to build the greatest success? Because there's no doubt there's spectacular insight and technology and understanding of how to scale up enterprises coming from a place like Silicon Valley. But now is the opportunity to also step back and listen and say, well, what's different in Jakarta? What is different in Cairo? What's going on there regulatorily, last mile logistics, culturally, and so on, that we can never understand? And the act of merely showing up no longer means that you win, because now customers everywhere, by the billions, have access to choice of product that serves them on their terms. And in many respects, this is now only being accelerated by COVID. So one, I think it's an incredibly exciting time in that sense. But secondly, it means a different kind of engagement where there's a lot Silicon Valley has to learn. And there's a lot, of course, that Silicon Valley can bring to the table. And this is true, I think, of anyone in any country looking to engage in a global engagement.
Yes, thank you. So speaking of COVID, everybody knows there's been, a lot of technology shift recently, whether it's like more working from home or online education. In so many aspects, COVID has changed people's lives and their perspectives on technology. So first of all, I'm kind of curious to ask, Chris, have you discovered any pattern, like sort of unique in this COVID period that people are using technology? Do you find anything like quite inspiring? And do you like observe any new trend that was probably going to stay even after the COVID?
Yeah, I mean, you have to step back and underscore, because I can talk in a way that makes me sound hopeful, because I am hopeful. And it's important to underscore how, difficult and terrible this time is for so many people. And I'll make an observation in a moment in this question about that. But I don't want that to be lost. But like we know throughout history, it is often in time of crisis and often in time of very great difficulty that some of the great innovation can happen, and that people will see the world in different ways, sometimes for better and sometimes for ill. Having said that, there are a series of things happening now which are quite seeable. And then there's one kind of area that's less seeable that I think I spend a lot of time anyways thinking about. And seeable, in one word, is really about acceleration. There are many things that have been happening globally in terms of adoption of technology, and the fact that most countries now have 60, 70, 80% of their populations with a smart device in their pocket, which means 60, 70, 80% of the populations have a supercomputer in their pockets. Most of the rising market countries have 30, 40, 50% of their populations under 30, which is a completely new digital first kind of dynamic. All of this was happening. But honestly, some of it was still happening relatively slow. So for example, we all know now that everyone likes an opportunity who can to buy and have things delivered to their homes. And you and I will say, well, we've been doing e-commerce for a decade. But even in America, Amazon represents maybe 12%. E-commerce is maybe 12% of total retail sales. So it's still kind of moving along at a clip, but at a clip. All of a sudden, COVID happens. And you could pick your favorite number or your favorite cliche. 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of human behavior shifted and happened within 60 days. And this certainly is areas like buying and selling and delivery of goods and the whole ecosystem around it. I've invested in a few companies that are like Uber for trucks around the world. Not Uber, but Uber for trucks, the kind of platform. And I would have thought this would be a very difficult time for them. And they're all growing 80 to 150% month over month because of e-commerce, because so many people want delivery. So that acceleration is happening. I think one of the most exciting accelerations that we can only beginning to understand what it means, though again, China in a way is a window to what this means, is the adoption of financial inclusion and payments and cashless transactions. And so China, of course, has been the great leader of this and has succeeded in it in many ways. India has been trying to make a kind of a forced functioning of it for some years, but now it's happening everywhere. I mean, a lot of people miss this, but the Saudi government made a requirement a couple of months ago that there be effectively no cashless transactions. They took a country and a region that still is heavily COD, cash on delivery, and effectively said, guys, you've got to find an alternative now. It could be a credit card, it could be a mobile payment, but this is a huge shift of which I think, we would talk about one day the world will be cashless 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Well, maybe it's 3 years from now, right? You mentioned a little bit earlier about digital education. We will rethink education in different ways because of this acceleration. Absolutely the ability to talk to your doctor in the way that we're talking now, with the comfort and security and the empowerment of being at home. These things will move. And so all of this acceleration, I think a great deal about in the exciting innovators that I see. The one that's a little bit less seen, but my scientist friends talk a lot about right now, is there's just been massive acceleration of research and money put into research, not only in AI, which again has been happening for a long time, but AI and related technologies geared towards biotech, genomics, and areas like that. So under the covers, there is going to be literally 5 to 10 years of behavior shifted into 6 months happening in the highest levels of research, I think in America and elsewhere around the world. And so all this to me, I'm keeping an eye on and trying to figure out how this may play out and what kind of opportunity to better society and to make investments that could be. The cautionary note that I will leave you with is if what I'm saying is true, which is more people are relying on virtualness than ever before, if more people have access to technology than ever before, if more people are functioning and doing their jobs with technology than ever before, we cannot lose sight of the fact that over 2 billion people around the world have no access to any of it at all. And so acceleration of that behavior means deceleration for 2 billion people. We're effectively saying to 2 billion people, sure, you can have a job, just you're never allowed to go on a road. That's what we're saying. And in America and other places in the world, we think a lot about, or have talked maybe a lot about, the digital divide. I actually believe, one, it's an unbelievable opportunity now, but it's actually an obligation for us to really be thinking about, because that's where I think a much greater impact will have in society as we begin to lift everyone to be able to have access to this opportunity that could be pretty interesting.
Right. So yeah, you're saying there are like mainly two trends, and like it is very important for people, we as a society, as a more privileged group, to figure out how to actually use technology to just more contribute to social good. So yeah, that's a good point. And I want to, since you mentioned a lot of technologies earlier or their applications, now we're probably going to just go more detail into some of them. So let's start with online education, or like everybody forced to take online courses for now. And currently there has been a lot of debate about, what is the roles of online and offline education developing, and what is the true value of education. So do you anticipate additional technology-related ways of acquire knowledge that may shape the way we learn and boost productivity in the economy? And do we also see a role for technology in achieving faster process on the education side, both for basic education and also for like industry-specific skills?
So it's an incredibly powerful question. And at one level, the kind of simple and cheat answer is it's subject to acceleration like everything else is. Like, we have known for years, and I studied this a lot in the Middle East, that you can look at the demographics of young people coming to the fore and the number of kids who need to be schooled. And if you look at mathematically, I mean, I'm going to make the number up, but in Egypt, you have to create hundreds of thousands of schools in order to be able to have kids get basic education in a traditional mindset, right? Which isn't going to happen. So at that level, people have known for a while and have been working towards it around the world, that one of the ways to make education more scalable and more affordable is to think about leveraging technology. So that makes a lot of sense at the theoretical level, but the fact of the matter is its application and its engagement is often very, very difficult. What is the value that is gotten in what kind of curricula delivered to whom, who has access to what kind of technology overall? And so interestingly, while there are people who've done well, and there's some amazing ed tech companies that are out there, it's been an area that I've leaned back on a little bit, because I wasn't sure that some of the theses were worked out on the application of technology for them. And often you have to wrestle, are you selling it into the existing system, i.e. you're not revolutionizing the system, you're just giving tools of efficiency or engagement to them, or are you actually creating interesting and different experiences? And in a way, that's why I'm actually starting to rethink looking at this space again, because to something that you said almost parenthetically, we really are opening up an opportunity to have a real conversation about what is the value of an educational experience. Now, if you're going to Princeton right now, you've just been told that this year, at least, you're now going to have an online experience. Now, at one level, you can say, if you really believe an online experience is a fantastic way to learn, you should be happy, and that is what it is. You sacrifice something, but it's good. I can't tell you the number of parents who have come out and said, I didn't plan to spend $50,000 for an online course, which immediately means that they're degrading what that quality or opportunity could mean. And so that then begs the question, one, what does make for a quality experience technologically? I can tell you from my own kids that doing effectively MOOCs is almost akin to reading a newspaper through PDF. It just didn't work that well. But that means that there's opportunity to create different kinds of engaging experiences. But secondly, the bigger question is, what does it mean to be educated? Does it mean a 4-year course that you have to do in a traditional sense? There's certainly benefits to it, but maybe there aren't others. Certainly in the job market, there's a signaling benefit that if you go to a top university anywhere in the world, an employer will want to employ you. And that's where this becomes full circle. Because there are people, and Udacity's been doing this for a while here in America, and there are others that are beginning to partner with employers to help them say, what skills do you need technologically, like AI, inclusion in terms of how you can have a better distribution of women and other people of color and else in your company, or it could be literally down to a management issue. It could be writing skills, it doesn't matter. What do you need as an employer to make someone hireable? And if we start getting to a point where some of these new innovations that come offer that signaling value and offer concrete skills that people can apply to jobs, I think we're going to be rethinking this. This is purely anecdotal, but it's interesting. I had this conversation giving a talk last summer with about 250 quote unquote young leaders in Europe. It just happened to be a gathering I was at and was asked to speak to. And we were talking about this. And I asked for a show of hands. Now remember, all these young people are going to Oxford and they're going to the greatest universities in Germany and France and what have you. And the question I said is, how many of you think that your children will graduate a 4-year university, or will it be something else? And very few hands went up. Even they expected that we're going to have a revolution in conversation, as long as we can really understand what helps make people learn, how does it translate to make them employable, and how does it translate to make them better citizens in their countries and in the world. So I'm looking at it again, but it's not going to be like all of a sudden a brand new technology just turns it on, because the questions to me are not just technology questions.
Right. Yeah. I think the debate just goes on about whether, the signaling effect, and also like I would know, like some people would argue that if you go to a prestigious university, it like knowledge is just only a small fraction of it. There's also networking. There's also other sort of social resources that you cannot get elsewhere. But there's definitely a trend that, technology has helped the democratization of just education. So I think this is something that we all sort of look forward to seeing more diverse outcomes. Yeah, right. So I think you also mentioned financial inclusion was one of the shift in this COVID phrase. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? And also, I know like China is planning to sort of like release a digital currency. This has already been a debate. Well, Facebook last year, sort of like a failed temptation. So do you think like also like digital currency matter to like central banks? And does like technology really increase price transparency for customers? And where is for the cashless future, is it like really reachable, or like it's just more in debate right now?
So you're asking in a way two powerful questions. One is about financial inclusion and kind of where that's going. Then of course, what role does currency writ large even mean, let alone a cryptocurrency or just a virtual distribution or mobile distribution of that which we understand and have today. And I think a lot about this because on the first case about the power of financial inclusion is that in many respects, financial inclusion is almost in and of itself a platform. There are just so many multiplier benefits that happen when people who did not have access to being able to have safe transactions, to be able to get credit scoring in a different kind of a way, or no credit scoring at all because of data, but couldn't in fact get loans. Like all of a sudden, so many parts of the world have so many deep gray people in the gray economy. There's an opportunity now to have them kind of engage in ways that can help them create growth in very powerful ways. And I'll give you, a concrete example of this. There's a wonderful company in Kenya that I've supported for a while called Twiga, and they're effectively an ag distribution tech company overall. In Nairobi, there are 150,000 fruit vendors who every day get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and walk 2 hours to one wholesale market to get their supplies one time that day, walk all the way back, sell them, that's it. There's no opportunity for them to really grow or to understand their inventory management. They're stuck with one kind of source for this. And there's certainly no data that's being involved, even though Kenya is actually a very mobile first kind of country now with M-Pesa. Anyway, these entrepreneurs came at it and said, something, we can make this kind of hands dirty distribution and effectively create other market solutions for you. But once you start engaging in that, and once you start sharing data with us because you're doing your transactions on the phone, we can begin to assess the credit possibilities for you. And it's an early testing stage for them in the last year. But all of a sudden, people who never had access to credit before are getting access to credit and they're paying back, which means they can do more, which means they can have more than one delivery of produce a day. They can expand into other products. They can expand their services. And so it's a multiplier effect. It's just not merely ability to say, I now have to walk 500 miles to hand my parents $50. It is, I can do that now digitally, but on top of that, I have access to all sorts of other kinds of services and capabilities that were all but ignored either by necessity or out of choice by so many parts of the world. Because in so many parts of the world, frankly, the traditional banking and finance system benefited quite well, thank you very much, by servicing the top 20, 25, 30% of population. Trying to figure out the complexity of offering services elsewhere economically was very hard. Now there are entrepreneurs and now there are entrepreneurial financial institutions that are saying, wait a minute, these people can be as great credit risks as anyone else. Wait a minute, people anywhere can have real opportunities to transact and build their businesses and scale their businesses in powerful ways. And so that just becomes, very, very kind of interesting. And it's in a way, almost a win-win for everyone. Policymakers win for obvious reasons. Entrepreneurs win. People, human beings around the world win. The people who don't take it seriously could lose and be disrupted. But even they who begin to think about those services have new opportunities, which are very powerful. How this will translate into how we move value in terms of what currency will be there or what have you, I think is still open. I have been from the beginning very intrigued by Bitcoin and the crypto concept because I love transparency, I love trust, I love consistency, which is one of the great things, and low cost, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting and engaging. And so there's no question that's going to be part of the ecosystem. Governments will wrestle with it either on their own or fight it. And then there'll be other currencies that will be obviously available in mobile money that's happening right now. And I think the real answer is we're going to see how it plays out. What I have no doubt about is that people will want transparency, safety, low-cost transactions in the moving of value in form, because we've seen that happen wherever it has begun. And it certainly has happened at scale in China. So I think it's very exciting, but I don't have a crystal ball on literally how the currency element of it will play out.
Right, certainly. So let's move on to the next question. So you already, you mentioned in your last question that, there's in regard to digital currency and the future of like a more inclusive financial system. So it seems like the application of different technologies has already changed the inner workings of societies. And during this process, we'll definitely say people benefit from them, but also in other aspects, with people who are, their benefits going to be hurt. So in terms of both societal roles and business models for companies, so how do we identify this, these opportunities and all the winners and losers, and how do people and companies prepare for the future amidst all the uncertainties?
So again, two really powerful questions. One is kind of the preparation for what is coming and how perhaps I as an investor think about the kind of venture that's worth putting money in, supporting and mentoring and helping every way. And the second is, what are the ramifications of technology, some of which can be, revolutionarily wonderful, and many of which can be very, very dangerous. And taking the second question in a way first, that has always been true. I think that we lose track sometimes, and we often like to blame technology, and sometimes we have to blame some bad actors. But I think overall, we forget that technology is amoral. It's not moral, it's amoral. And it becomes moral or it becomes societally impactful when we make decisions about what it is we use it for, what are the red lines or the bumpers that we have about where we're willing to go with it. But very importantly, and I think really, really ignored today, what we as individuals, as consumers, but as citizens and people of humanity are willing to stand up for and accept, right? So, I mean, there's a conventional wisdom in America that Facebook and a lot of these platforms have become evil or problematic. And I don't have any doubt that they need to rethink things, and at scale, they can lose track of certain key things that they need to address in very powerful ways. That's been true of almost any company anywhere in the world that has ever scaled. At the same time, the fact of the matter is, a lot of things in like areas like fake news and whatever can be controlled by the individual. If you have curiosity, if you have a willingness to try to reach out of your kind of echo chamber or your bubble to hear other things. If you're presented by something and say, that might be right, but I'm not sure it's right, I'm going to do a little bit extra work to find it out. I think often the individual responsibility is not focused on because it's easier to blame wealthy people or big institutions. And what I want to leave you with is both are true. And a conversation needs to be had at a time, as I said in my introduction, talking about you guys, this is a time when we need conversation and not just finger pointing and not just simplistic indictment, but an opportunity for people to really engage so we can answer what is going to be progressively one of the most important questions of our era, which is, as AI and other things come, what does it mean to be human? What is it that we want from technology? What are the red lines that we don't want it to cross? And by the way, there have been models for this. You know, in the mid-70s, a lot of academics and other people got together and really just kind of on their own settled bottom up what are some of the red lines in around biotech, which have been astoundingly still engaged in today. And so now it's going to be very different because the world is global and technology is everywhere and bad actors are often not state actors. Yes, there's more complexity, but that doesn't take away, one, from the importance of individual responsibility and the importance of engaging in such powerful ways in a conversation so that we can help having those bumpers and those arbiters hopefully ahead of the crisis, because so often we have these conversations once something bad has happened, right? I mean, we really got a serious conversation about nuclear weapons after the bomb was dropped. COVID is a glorious opportunity. We've been talking about COVID scientifically and humanly, or some kind of disease of this nature for years. Now it's reminded us that it can really happen, and hopefully we can have conversations about what is it that we are willing to do globally to try to not only ameliorate and fix it, but to be better prepared going forward. When I think about the people who are trying to engage in some version of that, and frankly, I don't care if they're policymakers or they're young entrepreneurs I'm looking to invest to, it all begins with the individual. This drives some entrepreneur. I get pitched at, literally, I see hundreds of pitches a year. I'm pitched, you know, half a dozen times a day. And I drive the entrepreneurs a little bit crazy because they have their deck and they have their script and they want to talk about all the business ramifications or whatever. And I almost never talk about the deck in the first meeting. I want to understand who they are. I want to understand why they're building what they're building as opposed to other things they could be doing. I want to understand, do they have that tenacity to go through the sine waves of catastrophe, which happens in almost every startup? And are they willing to kind of walk it through and listen to data and learn as they go? And, you know, you can slow them down, but you can't stop them. And I want to really get a sense if they thought about the market ramifications and how big the thing kind of can be overall. And then after that, obviously the business plan and the technology. The business plan in an early stage company often gets trumped quite quickly. But I want to know that they understand the levers of what they're building. And I want to understand that they know where technology is going and what might hit them around from other technologies and other people doing similar things around them. But that's really where it begins. And once I have conviction that this woman is just not going to stop, she's going to keep coming at me. And it's in an area that I understand. And it's an area where I think there's a large TAM, you know, market share. I get very excited very quickly. And I and my partners like to support them in every way that we can.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you talk a lot about you know, how tech can possibly affect the economy, and also how I think you end it with always ends with like a very optimistic note. It's like even though it's a big platforms and like with all the fake news, individuals can find ways to combat it and just to, you know, put in your own effort and to just really come out of your own, you know, your own small bubble and to just understand other groups and, you know, communities better. So in terms of the effects that technology has on economy, and since you mentioned you're unapologetic, you know, for advocator for globalization, so do you think that you know, some people are being very pessimistic about the future of globalization with everything going on and current political tension, but do you think that technology in more generally will lead us, you know, in the further pursuit of globalization? And do you think it can help to stem this effect, or do you think there are several other aspects that we need to just be really careful about?
I mean, look, it's a very powerful question, and I think a lot about it overall. I am a hopeful man. I mean, optimism is sort of that you think everything's going to work out. I do not think everything's going to work out. I just think that there are lenses and capacities that we can take glass half full and run with it and make something happen. I mean, on the glass half empty, there's not a lot I can do about that anyways, except to figure out a way to fill it, which means I have to focus on the other side of it. And I've met very few people in my life, if any, who've created something that was never there before, who are pessimists, just by the definition of what it takes to be there. Having said that, and we would have had this conversation even without COVID, it's a tough world out there, right? There are lots of things happening here that at one point I was getting quite excited about that have happened, that have been almost 180 degrees from where I hoped it could be. Human nature is human nature. Power politics still plays a role that it does. We are individuals who are insecure at times. We are individuals who are greedy at times. There are individuals who want not too much complexity. And this is a very complex world. There's a wonderful theologian in the 40s and the 50s named Reinhold Niebuhr, who had a quote that I think about all the time. And the quote was, he was describing orthodoxy, firm conviction on orthodoxy, but it's a greater truism. And he said, it's only when people are unsure that they are doubly sure. Only when they are unsure, they are doubly sure. And to me, that is a human, very natural human reaction, that when you were hit with too many inputs and too many things that you understood growing up begin to evaporate, it is very, very natural to want to gravitate to a thing, to some kind of North Star that can make sense to you. And therefore, it can make sense to want to lock down. It can make sense to look at people abroad that you don't understand as enemies. And those enemies may sometimes act in ways that you really are genuinely not comfortable with. Some of it may be a lack of understanding, but that's where the conversation and dialogue becomes important, because sometimes in life you will have confrontation and should, and other times you can find shared interests while you're even having confrontation, which can work. And sometimes you can garner a better understanding of what's happening around you that opens up doors that you could not see before. And so that to me is very much the kind of hallmark of the time that we're in. I have no problem with countries rethinking 70-year mindsets, right? There's no reason not to have a reasonable conversation about institutions formed 70 years ago. There might be something to say whether it applies to the 21st century. That's fine. After COVID, to say, maybe I should rethink my supply chain is almost commonsensical. That's not necessarily jingoistic or anti-technology or anti-anyone. It becomes a very serious conversation based on the realities of the learning that any country went through in this very, very powerful time. And I think the problem is that people will often go to the simple and not to the conversation, because that's often the nature of politics or the dynamics at the kind of top-down level. And where the hope for me lies is that, for the most part, bottom up, particularly from the younger generation, and I see this both in policymakers and always in entrepreneurs and technology people overall, is they're literally problem solvers. They're trying to look at the data, not because they want to make the data true, it's because what is it telling them that gives them an opportunity to constantly innovate and to pivot and to go sort of build to the area that they want to build. So that element to me is an incredibly hopeful one. And because it's bottom up, almost no one spends a lot of time thinking about it except for the entrepreneurs who are on this call. But you think about any country you're in, you think about how much media coverage is talking about hopeful innovation happening bottom up. Tell me how many stories you can tell me that you've heard in the last 6 months about people. And often it's people in local government. Often it is people in nonprofits. It could be people as educators, and as often entrepreneurs who are solving things that we just don't simply hear about. Or if we do, we get suspect and put them in a box. And I just think it's an opportunity for us to step back a little bit and understanding that this time is allowing us to put almost any idea on the table. But that means that we have to be able to engage in it, in an engagement, and not merely as a way to make it a battering ram to confirm a bias that we may have to begin with.
Great. So I've asked a lot of questions to now, and I know a lot of people wanted to raise questions, and now we're gonna just open up the floor to everyone who wants to ask questions. And okay, so Lucas, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure, thanks, Yunxin. Hey, Chris, great to see you. Thank you so much for speaking on this fascinating discussion. So I just had two quick questions. The first one, you've been talking about this great technology shift, and we're seeing in the US, I think, increasingly us turning inward. There's the new visa announcements, which are quite disturbing for many, I think, young entrepreneurs. I was wondering how you see that affecting the technology shift, whether that's created new opportunities for others, or if it's having more of a net negative effect or a net positive effect for other countries. And then second, you talk about, rethinking institutions and going back and looking at the frameworks. You wrote in your recent newsletter about the role that policymakers can play in helping young entrepreneurs develop their businesses. And one of the pieces of advice you said was for them to just get out of the way. But the other piece of advice that you gave was for them to work and collaborate with entrepreneurs. So in the US, we're seeing, I think, a new debate about the need for maybe industrial policy or more funding and capital going into innovative areas. So I was wondering where you see the US policy in terms of entrepreneurship going, or if there's other countries where you think they're being much more successful in developing new and innovative strategies to help entrepreneurs and new businesses grow.
Lucas, great questions, and it's great to see you. I mean, your writing has taught me probably as much as almost anything that I've focused on, particularly in China, but on global stuff in the last 2 years. So it's an honor to see you. Look, I think taking the second question first overall, it is very easy, and a lot of us in the business world will say easily that the best role the government can do is just step back and let the entrepreneurs do what they can do. And there are plenty of times when governments and regulation have either missed opportunity or have sat on opportunity in ways that can be very problematic. But it is cavalier, because I think at the same time, there's just an unbelievable opportunity for some kind of co-authorship that you can really say, is there a Venn diagram of needs? And the old kind of Silicon Valley view was, get permission later, launch, move quickly, and then when you hit the regulators, you hit the regulators. And there'll be moments where I think that remains, maybe not an unwise strategy. But I've been very intrigued, particularly in areas like fintech, which is going to be a regulated kind of area overall. Some surprising parts of the world where conversations are happening very early on, again, because as I said before, people are really trying to get it right because everyone benefits from it. Like if you're in a government, it's better for you to have more people out of the gray economy. You can actually tax people more if you have better transparency in what they're doing. You can have better record keeping. You can create data services for which other kinds of opportunities can be built. And so in very surprising places, right? I mean, we all know that Singapore has been interesting on this. Dubai has been interesting on this. Estonia has been interesting on this. It used to be kind of just said it's the place where these kind of small, innovative 20th, 21st century leaning almost city states have been playing. But lo and behold, we've seen elements of it very successful in other parts of the world. We can get into a debate about what America does and what China does and everything else, but there have been clear examples of very positive aspects of this across the board. But I've been very intrigued by, believe it or not, Brazil and Indonesia, whose governments in both cases have been spending a tremendous amount of time meeting with entrepreneurs, meeting with venture capitalists, and really going through not how to make quote unquote banking rules kind of adaptable to the 21st century, but asking questions like, if none of those had existed, what would we need now to the benefit of creating economic growth, more jobs, greater transparency in terms of transactions? And the jury is still out. We'll have to see, where that will play out. But everything I've talked about, from a Singapore to that, these are models that the world should be looking at. And we can criticize them and we can say they may be incomplete or they're only opening up doors for higher security checks. I mean, sure, we can have that conversation. But yet it is intriguing that that kind of dynamic could be a constructive model coming from unobvious parts of the world, at least to Americans, that it could be instructive of how to do it well. In America, by the way, I think that there are some good examples of it, and a lot of them are more at the local level. I know, talking to a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley, they've dealt with kind of a rising new generation of almost technocratic people at the state level and the city level who know they've got hard problems to solve and that these solutions could in fact help them to do that. And then I've of course run into ones who've had the complete opposite. So it's a journey, but I think one that's becoming quite interesting. And Luke, your first question, remind me?
The first question was just about the recent visa announcements in the US and how you see that affecting the shift.
I mean, look, very little can worry me more, because I think, and I was a big supporter of extensions of H-1B visas before, because I know at the end of the day that there's incredible innovation that comes from everywhere in the world. It helps companies here get bigger. Yes, sometimes people will go back, but that's great because we have new partnerships. Sure, sometimes there are going to be security issues, but you address those issues in those terms. But I was very struck not long ago, maybe about a year ago, I was with a very senior person at Singapore who kind of looked at me over a table and said, "Hey, Chris, what do you think is the best thing that has happened to global AI innovation?" And I kind of thought about it, and I had gave some kind of stupid technology answer. And he said, "No, the best thing that has happened for global AI innovation is your immigration policy." And what he meant was, you let all the talent leave, that talent is going to build elsewhere. And why would that be in our interest? And frankly, I think there's a reciprocity to it. I mean, there's something that can be unleashed globally by that which we do very well in this country with that kind of global talent. So it worries me, no doubt.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Hi there. Hoping not to interject. My name is Jacob Cannon. I'm from the USA. I've worked actually in Beijing at China for a bit. So global innovation is very a point of curiosity for me. Thank you so much for being with us, Chris. My question is more segues off Lucas's first question, and it's about technology, cooperation, and governments. Specifically about opportunities for tech cooperation in today's age. We see some, as Yunxin said, unnerving things, the visa policies with academic exchanges. We see national interest playing into the freedom of transmission and transaction of apps across the world. And given, we also see there are certain technologies that become core infrastructures or national assets that different countries are competing for. And given there's a lot of this exclusive competition, I wanted to ask about what you think are effective spaces for cooperation on tech between countries and governments nowadays, and if there are, what are the most effective channels? And the other aspect really is, even if there's exclusive competition between countries, for example, for AI or autonomous, does that really matter? Is an all boats rising situation where we get farther anyways, even if there's not cooperation among countries?
Well, Jacob, it's great to see you, and thank you for that. And thank you also for what you've taught me about Didi and your amazing role of kind of understanding America and China in a very unusual and unique lens. Look, I think at one level, the experience of COVID should be the instructive answer to your question, in that what circumstance could we have possibly created for which everyone has a shared interest in getting it solved and making sure that it never happens again? And it's it should be the ultimate kind of global engagement kind of exhibit A in many respects. And in some respects, particularly I think at the science community level, there have been some elements that have done that very well. But I think much more broadly than that, it's become obviously a finger-pointing exercise too often and a blame game too often. And governments, all governments, are not good at saying, here's what we messed up, and here's what we learned from what we messed up. Here's what we did well, and we need to do more of. Here's what someone over there did well, and that they did well doesn't mean that somehow we're bad, but is in fact a co-authorship of understanding to build stuff. And when you step back and really think about it, there are a host of issues that are sort of fit that category. A disease like this is that way. Certainly the environment is a massive global technology opportunity where shared learning can only benefit everyone equally, I think, in that regard overall. There are things in the national security area that of course are competitive, but there are others that are important. These red line, I mean, people talk about it, and that therefore means they don't understand AI, right? They talk about that someone will win AI. That's not the conversation. The conversation has to be, what are the red lines that we want society and globally to kind of function with? What are the areas that we think AI can be most powerful? And the fact is, if someone feels one way about it and feels significantly the other way, it can have a multiplier, global ramification. So that is the kind of debate. And even when, you know, my friends both in China and in America will kind of get into the finger pointing exercise, I get it and I understand it. And I can tell you very bluntly, there have been many things that I've seen globally and in China and elsewhere from a pure business perspective that are concerning to me. Like, fine, we can have that conversation, but let's get beyond just that. That's something that has to be talked about. Let's talk about where also are the shared interests as part of this. And I think when it comes to tech and innovation, there is a real big, you know, potential there. Now, when you look at it in business ideas, if you believe and if you have evidence that in the free market of ideas, or there's a hope for the free market ideas, your IP will be taken, or your business model will be taken, that's a real problem, right? And you know, businesses are always competitive, and I don't have any problem with that. But there is a certain sense, and quite frankly, it's one element of the past for which I think the global economy has benefited greatly on, is a sense of a rules-based engagement and authority by which we can say to each other, we are going to live within these parameters, and we'll meet on the competitive field of battle, but we do believe at the end of the day, certain principles will be respected. And it's when one side says that's not the case that that kind of exchange and dialogue becomes problematic. And there are examples of it on many sides, but the fact remains. There are amazingly shared opportunities that collectively we are better engaging in ways to do them. And at the same time, it also entails a certain respect of engagement that I think we all can do a hell of a lot better in kind of creating going forward. And it will entail also uncomfortably holding people accountable. And we just have to accept that as part of the dynamic. But we've lived with that before. It shouldn't be that new. But somehow or other in this new world, it has manifested itself in new ways, that some of which I don't understand.
Thank you.
Chris, I'd like to go next. I'm Shubho. We'd met at Shotsun College last year. Thank you so much for being with us today. I had two questions. So sort of building on Lucas's questions. So today, speaking from India with our current current tensions with China and the fight against COVID, there's a sense of protectionism that's building in, and there's a rise of nationalism, and this is happening in countries around the world. And over the past decade, when companies like Uber and Airbnb sort of became models for other companies, you had the Uber of X and the Airbnb of this, and now you see the Ubers and the Airbnbs themselves being very vulnerable, right? So as a global investor, what do you think the future of globalization and global supply chains is going to look like? And like, what are sort of the permanent changes you see out of this? And something that, I've been following your posts on LinkedIn a lot. It's really good to see optimism in such dark times. And as Mark Anderson would say, it's time to build. And, I'm sort of currently working on an e-commerce website for selling masks in India. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and advice you would give to graduates, graduates from this year's class, and also to entrepreneurs during this time.
It's great to see you again, Julian. I love the program. The Schwarzman Fellow Program is something I've gotten to know in the last year, and have just been in awe of the efforts to really have this kind of bridge building and understanding. And so you were a great example of it, and other people like Jake and others I've met have benefited from that. And I think we will all benefit from it. Look, I am a hopeful man. Again, I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful, right? I do believe that things are happening that we can take control of, but I can get on this subject not hopeful. Because I see a scenario that if you and I were having this conversation 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, I didn't believe would happen. In fact, I probably would have thought the opposite would happen. And that is kind of a balkanization of technology. And this is obviously something that manifests itself quite strongly in the China-American relationship. And what ends up happening at that scale is that other people feel like they have to make choices. But at the same time, Europe has talked about creating their own alternative to AWS. Other parts of the world I go to, India is another example. A lot of folks are saying, what is it that we need to own or have, or what is it that we want to develop for our people on their own terms? Where I still have a bias that talent is everywhere, and when talent can engage in collective ways, the multiplier impact of that is much greater than the balkanization. So I worry about it a great deal, and I'm not sure I have a great conclusion about it. I certainly think about it as an investor, as I think about the ramifications that it could manifest itself in, but it cuts both ways, right? Because I will talk to entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia or entrepreneurs in Latin America, and at one level they may be in awe of America or in awe of China, but at another level they're like, both you guys back off. We're going to use these tools and build something on our terms for the audiences we want to reach. And that can be also exciting to me. That may not end up being a balkanization, but it may be sort of taking the best of other practices and making something new out of it. But to balkanize politically, to balkanize economically, to balkanize technologically is a very dangerous scenario to me. And therefore, and I would say this to anybody that's in university or graduate school and everyone else, I think that while the pressure is often to be kind of looking in, one, it is very good to reassess things, and you will make certain determinations that may make sense about doing things differently. But two, fighting to have an understanding of the world around you on the world's terms, not in the way necessarily you want it to be, or not what your view is when you land there and spend a week wandering around the city, but trying very hard to understand, which we never will well or perfectly, but to begin the journey of understanding why people are thinking the way they do, why their lens is what their lens is. It doesn't matter if they disagree with you, it doesn't matter if it's different than you, it's just part of an aggregation of truth. And none of us will ever have truth, but we can at least start asking better questions. And in some respects, what I wish for people, like you asked me, is, it's part of your mission to start asking the best questions you can possibly ask. Don't try to be right all the time. Try to really listen much more than you talk, and do everything you can to aggregate that understanding, because you'll have a better conclusion of where things go. If I didn't get on the ground to the Middle East 10 years ago, and by the way, I'd been to the Middle East many times as a tourist and a guy who loves history and that kind of stuff, But if I didn't force function my way into hearing a different conversation from a different audience, from a different generation, I would still be looking at the Middle East the way most people who watch CNN look at the Middle East. And I would miss what's literally happening among a whole other hundreds of millions of people. And so you got to be able, when we can, to get on the ground and to refine the ability to ask questions, because your judgments will be better, your contribution to society will be better, and so that's night and day difference between whether your company will succeed.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris, so we have a question in the chat area from Yunxin Sharon Zhang. And she asked about what pitch message will you speak to investors from Western countries to look at investing in the greater New Bay Area of China, which is like Shenzhen, Zhuhai area, and given the current, challenging political and economic situation. So what would be the key message?
Look, I think the reality is that there are dynamics top down that make it very, very difficult for the kinds of engagement that can be powerful bottom up. And some of them are very real and very substantive issues that I think do have to get resolved top down. But at the same time, the fact of the matter is, and you're still seeing this happen a little bit, opportunities where entrepreneurs may be able to co-author opportunities either within these countries or possibly in different parts of the world. And, but there's not a lot of upside right now to do that. Investors aren't looking to invest in it, at least from the American perspective. Entrepreneurs are very, very focused on what they're building here at home. When they expand globally, they tend to expand to places which are either close geographically or ones that they understand better, like Europe and that kind of a thing. We're in this, what I will describe as kind of a pause, where I don't think that there's a great answer to it. There's still, it's so ironic because this is not just a technology question, right? I mean, how many agriculture companies can benefit by access to each other's markets? How much low-cost product can benefit by access to each other's markets? How many people can really benefit by a better, more straightforward engagement? It's such a potential there. But one cannot ignore the reality is that to do so right now is very difficult. And some of that difficulty is substantive. This is not just politicians missing a trend. There are substantive issues that need serious thought and resolution in an environment where it's hard to find both. But I don't believe that that will be the environment forever. So you just have to take it one day at a time.
Great, thanks. Anyone else has some questions?
Hi, Chris. My name's Anna. I'm also part of the YCW team in Beijing. It's really nice to meet you. I have two very different questions. So the first one, it really struck me when you said that, the central question that you're thinking about is, what does it mean to be human? I thought that was really interesting. And I kind of took it a step further, especially in the kind of US-China or in the current, situation that we see. I'm wondering whether you think that different societies will come to different conclusions on what does it mean to be human. I was especially thinking of kind of, I don't know, forays in medical sciences that we see, where some, countries or societies think certain things are ethical and others are unethical and things like that. So how is that going to be around tech? And so kind of can tech be apolitical? Or is it always as political as we make it because as humans we are political? So that's the one question. And then the other one, a little bit more practical, is when we think about startups in China and the US, like all across the board, where do you think the climate for founding a startup is better? Is it better in China or better in the US? And my internet isn't so good, so I'm going to turn off my video. Sorry for that.
That's all right, Anna. It's nice to meet you, and your questions were very clear and very important. Look, I think in a way to the first question about it is there's absolutely going to be both cultural and outlook ideas that are on substance, and some of it is just historic and the way people will view the world. Not everyone is going to agree on everything at all times. And I think the real question or the challenge that I put to both policymakers and business people is, okay, fair enough. Just make sure you're not sleepwalking with a series of assumptions about where the outcomes can. It's not that hard. You don't have to have a crystal ball or be a genius in scenario analysis to start looking at how certain scenarios play out if every country, or at least every large country, balkanizes in terms of area of AI and go completely on their own. It's not hard to build some cases of what that might look like. Is that what you want? Is that the best area? We may have no choice but to get that. It is possible that there's enough either substantive conflict, even at the bottom up level, or disagreement that may be inevitable. And certainly there's a risk at the policy level that that could happen. But the question still remains, is that what we want? And I think that there is a Venn diagram, like there is so much in life, of issues, of the bumpers, of what we care about, as we have found, you know, differences, but also, at least up until now, collections on things like nuclear weapons, on things like biotech, that we can look at each other in the eye and say, these outcomes are not the outcomes that we want. And we can find some shared engagement in that way. I think often a mistake, particularly on the policymaking side, is they take what I say and they say, okay, well, we need a nuclear test ban treaty of AI, or we need a nuclear test ban treaty of cyber. And that means they just simply don't understand the complexities and differences of the diffusion of technology everywhere, that there are non-state actors who are involved, that the dynamics, it doesn't lend itself necessarily to the counting of missiles as might have worked, you know, 10 or 20 years ago. It has to have a different kind of a dynamic, but the underpinning of that dynamic, I think, remains still the ability to really think about, you know, what is it that you want, and have that kind of conversation as a conversation. And if you don't solve it, you don't solve it, but at least you've taken a shot at doing it in a way, which I'd suggest does happen to some degree in the academic community and some of the science and tech community today, but I think should be a better and bigger part of the global conversation. You certainly will not hear any presidential candidate talking about it in a debate, which is a mind blow to me. But that's just the kind of nature of the lack of nuance that has become part of so much of global politics. Look, I think at the end of the day, people like to make a conversation, to your second question, about who's better, you know, China or Europe or America or whatever, as an ecosystem kind of stuff. And I really do believe, Anna, that it's a false question, right? I believe that there is lessons to be learned everywhere. And you can come down to a general conclusion about what kind of environment you want to live in or what kind of culture you want to live in. But I think at the end of the day, the gating question is, there are things out there that work, and anyone who sees them work on their own terms should say, is that applicable to what I'm doing? There are things that we screw up, and we should have the security and the openness and the self-confidence to say that was a mistake, let's move on and do something else. And then there's a whole room of saying, wow, based on this learning, now there's something I can envision that was never there before. And I'm a little bit biased because that's the very nature and essence of what great entrepreneurs do in a tech sector. But I actually think those three parameters can work in almost every aspect of engagement. And it's not about saying who's better or worse. It's not saying about who's risen or fallen. I just find these kind of foolish academic questions. They could become not foolish if we sleepwalk and don't take hold of very significant issues that all of us need to be thinking about, both individually but also globally. But I think the bigger questions are, we're in this world of amazing shift and change. What do we see that works? Let's throw more gasoline on it. What do we see that is problematic? Let's stop doing it and try to pivot around it without worrying about who's being blamed for it as much. And third, what are we learning that says to ourselves, we can envision something going forward that we couldn't even have talked about 5 years ago. 10 years ago, we couldn't talk seriously about 2/3 of the world walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. We couldn't think about it. We haven't talked in this conversation at all about what 5G could unleash. We'll talk about it in Washington. You talk about 5G as kind of a pissing match about stuff, and that's fine. There's substantive issues of disagreement that need to be debated. But where's the conversation about what behaviors might become fundamentally different if real 5G is something that's available globally? And again, all the other technologies we've only scratched the surface on. There are things that we have to worry about in terms of their parameters, but we can start saying to ourselves, man, if we get this AI thing right, and if we really get this kind of genomics understanding right, and we get the right parameters involved in this, like, we're going to cure cancer in less than a decade. Like, that's got to be the kind of parts of conversations that unfortunately happen at certain levels very powerfully. But I think in this environment right now, they don't happen enough publicly.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, this is Sarah Chen, and I did want to jump in here to question a few things. Good to see you again.
Right,
you talked a little bit about, you know, human behavior, and this time being really an interesting one where we can sort of reevaluate what we are investing in, what we're prioritizing, and you touched a little bit on sort of, you know, both sides of inclusion and also ethics, which brings me to one key question of what's happening with Facebook right now. I mean, you know, you're sitting here as a speaker representing sort of the view of America as an American entrepreneur, and many outside of America look at what's happening as almost a case study, right? When the big behemoth that is Facebook is now put into questioning in terms of how they've grown and what is truly accepted by community. What are your thoughts on that independent panel, and the job of, as Kara Swisher puts it, decontaminating Facebook, number one. And the second question that I had relevant to this with Young China Watches is, with the news on ByteDance, TikTok, I think Lucas perhaps asked this early on about national security issues, and Mike Pompeo recently saying that, US may ban all Chinese apps. What's the messaging here, and what do you think about basically what's happening with this?
So first of all, Sarah, it's great to see you as always. And some of you may know Sarah and some of her efforts, but there's probably not 3 people on earth who've been working very hard globally, but also with a lot of connection with Asia and America about particularly focusing on unleashing women talent and entrepreneurship and investing. And it's just very powerful kind of extension of unleashing a lot of talent that has too long and too often been underlooked. So it's just great to be with you. Look, I know it's not in to say this, but there is much about Facebook I still continue to admire. I will tell you that every day it still matters to me. I have connectedness to people that I would never have in its absence around the world. I see some things that people post because I admire them. I follow them for a reason. So when they post something to read, I actually want to read what they read, which is very powerful. And so at an individual level, it's kind of powerful. And then secondly, and like my friend here who's from India could tell you, the Facebook ecosystem is actually revolutionizing bottom-up business in places like India, which is unbelievable. I mean, I just had an amazing conversation with the guy who was having a conversation with a very small shoe sales business in the heart of India, and the transactions that they do begin on WhatsApp, and they verify the honesty and veracity of a transaction on WhatsApp. They will meet each other perhaps first on Facebook, and then move the transaction aspect of it onto WhatsApp. And then they'll do a consummation through banking because Facebook hasn't quite figured out that side of it. And the whole ecosystem has allowed so many people in so many parts of the world to engage the way that I get value out of engaging, but businesses are using them in such powerful and innovative ways, creating growth that they haven't done before. I mean, I think what happened to Facebook in Brazil is very instructive. I think they kind of blew it. I think they went in there, charging large fees and more of a PayPal model. Whereas if they went in there with WhatsApp and offering it almost for free, they could have completely revolutionized and become one of the maybe 3 or 4 what will be central players of financial inclusion in rising markets, because their CAC is almost 0 because everyone's got it. And while the solutions aren't necessarily great and are often jerry-rigged, people are entrepreneurial everywhere in the world and they're launching it. So that to me is stuff that should not be lost and is often lost in the debate about Facebook. But what's not lost in the debate about Facebook, which is true, is that they've had to go through an incredible experience of just making real mistakes and not understanding things or assuming certain things about themselves and their culture and the way their algorithms work that have forced them to rethink what they're doing. And I think the verdict is still out. We're going to see how they're going to do. People want to jump on every communication or anything that they do and sort of say that's evidence that they're still messing it up. I tend to be more charitable when people begin to try to pivot and see where they'll take it. And I think the jury is still out. We'll have to see whether it can continue to leverage so much of the power that it offers and at the same time, be understandable about the responsibility that it carries by the nature, not only of its scale, but of the tools that it has developed in very powerful ways. I don't have a lot of patience for people who summarily dismiss it as, corrupt and contaminated. I think what ends up happening is that we wake up one day and we can find ourselves in situations where we've ignored key problems that you can fix, and they can fix them. I mean, people used to talk about Microsoft this way not long ago. I think Satya has done an unbelievable job of changing the culture and the product dynamic and the engagement there. And so with intentionality and with listening and with co-authorship with a lot of people, because no one woman or man can make it happen, we can see where it goes overall. It does beg, however, a second related question, which is that often I think people worry about size for size sake. And so there's been a lot of talk, as you know, in America about going after some of the larger enterprises because they're quote unquote too big. And you want to have antitrust to break them up. And look, I think this is a really interesting time to debate this, because antitrust by history was about the possibility of large institutions price gouging regular people. That's what antitrust was built for, that if you become Standard Oil, you can declare pricing and people have to pay whatever you pay. Well, what does it mean to have antitrust when huge juggernauts are effectively giving you service for free? Because that's what Google does for all intents and purposes. That's what Facebook does for all intents and purposes. except that that's not true, because it's not really, it may be free from a money perspective, but it's not free from our data perspective. It's not free from our time perspective. And so there is something to think about. But the more important one that I think about is when these companies get so big, and I thought a lot about this when I spent some time in China last fall with a lot of the big juggernauts there in e-commerce and whatever. Can you get so big? Can your data become such an advantage? Can your capital become such an advantage that you actually squash innovation? And I think that's a serious conversation. I think it needs to be worked for. And I think that we don't have a clear answer of that, but that to me, I think is a more interesting conversation. And in a way, it leads to your question about ByteDance and TikTok overall. I mean, first of all, TikTok is an interesting case study. I think TikTok, like Pinduoduo, are two enterprises that have become juggernauts that a few years ago, everyone thought was that those territories were game over, that there's no room for an entrepreneur to win in social media and social engagement and eventually social commerce. And how could you win by creating another e-commerce company? Like, that can't happen. That's kind of one. And lo and behold, two juggernauts got created, notwithstanding. And I find that, kind of a good reminder that innovation doesn't necessarily get squashed, even if we think that we do. How that translates here, I think what we're seeing right now, and the policymakers are being very, very clear, is that this is a mallet to engage with China with some, absolutely sense of veracity and understanding of why they're doing it, with very reasonable concerns to understand about security and privacy, but is very much, it is now very much one of the levers which India has, of course, just reused recently, in part because of the conflict and of issues that have happened there, and for which this administration is unapologetically saying, at the end of the day, we are, one, very focused on what is being built here in America, and secondly, yes, we would like to find shared interests abroad, but first and foremost, we are not going to hesitate to use these mallets in ways that we hope could open up maybe opportunities for negotiation, but we don't know where they will play out. And so we're just gonna have to see.
Great, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sarah, for your questions. We are now about to hit the end of our event. So we still have like around 10 minutes. So everyone, if you still have questions, please chip in right now. For now, I'm gonna ask one last question here. So I think we talked a lot about technology, about entrepreneurship, and but also touch a little bit on tech and how technology could possibly influence our future and our society as a whole. So I'm kind of curious, Chris, where do you see in terms of how technology helps to raise the productivity of the society? Some people argue that with the advancement of AI technologies, eventually one day human beings will be freed from this mundane and like just labor, all this sort of labors, and have like more time to just be creative and just do whatever they're sort of what you actually want to do. So do you think that technology will finally let people work drastically fewer hours in the future? And also, like, broadly speaking, what do you think of the idea of a UBI, like a universal basic income? Do you think this is something that is actually doable in the future?
So we're actually seeing, I mean, for all the people who debated UBI and why it was a bad thing and whatever else, we're sort of living right now in a world of UBI, and certainly in America, we are living in a world of UBI in a way, in terms of what needed, in my view, unequivocally had to be done to help so many people who've been suffering so terribly in what we're going through right now. And so we're gonna have some real-time data to think about. Is it something that you do in a crisis? Is it something that will sustain? If it does sustain, why should it sustain? How do we think about it in terms of the greater ramifications of the stability of a government who's doing it? And so it has now become not just a theoretical exercise, but it's become now one that we can really kind of look at and begin to have a serious conversation about. There's no question, and I've seen this in some of the tech companies that I've invested in that have been working in moving of money in places like Africa, that often the very act of giving someone in poverty some cash, not necessarily a cow, not necessarily some product, but let them decide what they want to do with the money. It is really interesting how much they really understand what is the best way to have multiplier impacts from that money, how it can actually take them and their families to a different level. And data like that becomes very powerful about what that can be and should be debated openly and not ideologically. But as I say, we're gonna have a lot of data here, and we're gonna have to see, how we think about it. And often when you start talking about distribution of money, you're talking about government having largesse for political reasons. And that, of course, becomes very dangerous, or could become very dangerous too. So let the conversation begin. We have some case studies of it now, and let's see where we take about it. I think overall, look, in some respects, if you think about all the things I've been talking about, some of them, fairly high up, some of them examples in entrepreneurs' perspective, your question about the future of work is where all of this, the rubber hits the road. Because at the end of the day, why do we have technology? We have technology to make people's lives better, easier, faster, cheaper, more beautiful, more engaged, and so on. And at one level, people have said, and the argument has been now for some time, that technology will be a job killer. And I have always found that to be a little bit lazy, because at one level, it presumes, one, that work is zero sum, two, that the work that's available today is the best that we can do. And as you know, around the world, there are many people who are doing jobs which have their lives at risk, or have their mental outlook at risk, or keep them away from their families and everything else. And so there is an opportunity to ask the question, is that what we want for people to work? Do we have an assumption that that kind of a job is the only job that is powerful? Secondly, is we often define work as the job and not the skill. So I remember thinking not long ago, I had this conversation with someone, if I could hire a woman who was incredibly good with math, unbelievably good at customer service, meticulous in detail in everything that she did, understood technology in a very good way, would I want to hire that woman? And the answer is, well, if all things being equal, she sounds great. Well, I just described a bank teller, right? That's what a bank teller is. Now, interestingly, there's still lots of bank tellers today, but I don't think 10 years from now, there are going to be a lot of them. And so we can lament that bank tellers may go away, or we can say to ourselves, they have skills that we can work on that will be as relevant to the 21st century as the 20th. What I think is the biggest difference, which I don't have my mind around, and it's certainly worrisome and it's part of the conversation, is the speed by which this change will happen. Because we forget, if you have any sense of history, in the other times when there's been huge disruption, it has been disrupted. Even if it took 50 years for people to shift from farms to cities, it's not like even they had 50 years to do it and everything went smoothly. There was a tremendous amount of misery that happened in that period. And now we're talking about some shifts that could happen in a matter of years. And that becomes, I think, a very serious conversation as we think about, again, what are the boundaries and borders of what we want to do? And then, so my broader question is, what does it mean not only to be human, but to unleash the best of what is human in complementariness with technology? That could manifest itself in less work hours. It could manifest itself certainly in more flexible work hours, as we're seeing manifest right now. But we're going to have to see how that plays out. But it's very serious issues for which there's going to be opportunity. I will remind us that almost 80% of the jobs that are in existence today weren't in existence 25 years ago, or whatever the number is, 60%, 70%. So our imagination often doesn't understand the adaptation. But the reality is, there's no question that AI and robotics and new technology are going to replace repetitive jobs. And so that means there's an awful lot of jobs that we're going to have to think about in very new and different ways. And to me, that's opportunity, but it will come at great risk if we, again, sleepwalk in a direction of not taking it seriously in its complexity.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Is there anyone who has any questions? This is your last chance.
Can I say one last thing before you go, Yunxin?
Oh, of course.
And that is just, again, to say thank you, guys. I mean, you've got 100 webinars that come to you all the time. There's lots of places you can engage in a lot of the issues, and your questions were fantastic. And I do know some of you, and I certainly know the kinds of things that you do. And I just can't leave you enough with a belief that this is your time, right? This is your time. Like, this is an opportunity to step up. It's an opportunity to think differently, to not be too captured by too much legacy, but to be respectful that there are things which people find comfort in that must be respected as well, and that we can have a different kind of a conversation. And one of the reasons, again, I end as I began, why I respect an organization like yours so much is you are a perfect kind of forum to have those conversations as actual conversations, not finger pointing in social media, but really explorations, because I or no one have answers. We have better questions and we have theses that we can help work with each other. And that to me is very exciting. So it's been really fun for me to be with you.
Thank you so much for taking your time and being just so honest and, just engaging in our conversation. So yeah, it's been a very, very informative and just really exciting 1.5 hour. And now like our seminar is coming to an end. And thank you for everybody who participated and like stayed to the end. So thank you, Chris, again. We hope to probably host you in the future once again. Everybody, if you're still curious about what Chris is doing, you can follow him on Twitter and also on LinkedIn. He has a column called Seeking Awesome, which you guys should definitely check it out. And thank you for being here with YCW Beijing. And we hope that you can stay engaged, and hopefully we'll see you in our future seminars. So thank you very much, everyone. Good night. And yeah, see you next time. Thank you, Chris. Take care.
Thank you.